What if you were born into a world of unimaginable privilege, a prince of the most powerful empire on earth, but from the moment you drew breath, you were forever and irrevocably defined not by who you were but by who you were not? What if your entire life, every public appearance, every private whisper, every stern glance from your father reinforced one single, crushing idea: you were second best? This was not a fleeting childhood insecurity. It was a constitutional reality, a fixed point in the rigid constellation of royal succession. In the grand theater of the British monarchy, the roles were cast at birth. There was the heir, the focus of all hope and expectation. And then there was the spare, a contingency, a backup, an understudy waiting in the wings for a tragedy that everyone hoped would never come. This status, the spare, becomes a psychological weight, a burden of perceived inadequacy that can shape a personality, stifle a voice, and create a profound, lifelong struggle for self-worth. We believe these historical stories deserve to be told. If you found this video insightful, please show your support with a like, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and share this knowledge with others. This was the precise and heavy reality for Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George, known to his family simply as Birdie. He was the second son of King George V, a man who embodied the stern, unyielding duty of the crown. Birdie's life was lived entirely in the shadow of his older brother, Edward, known to the family as David. David was everything Birdie was not. He was the Prince of Wales, the heir apparent, and he was, by all accounts, a superstar. He was charismatic, handsome, modern, and effortlessly charming, capturing the adoration of the public and the press. He was the golden boy of the House of Windsor. Birdie, by contrast, was the quiet, unassuming spare. He was the Duke of York, a respectable but decidedly supporting role. He was not destined for the throne. He was destined to support it, to be a loyal brother, to cut ribbons, and to live a life of comfortable, dutiful obscurity. This inherent structural imbalance was cruelly amplified by a profound personal affliction. Birdie was shy, a natural introvert in a role that demanded constant public performance. More than just shy, he was plagued by a severe and debilitating stammer. This was not a minor hesitation. It was a neurological blockade that could turn a simple sentence into a painful, humiliating ordeal. He dreaded public speaking, an activity that was a non-negotiable cornerstone of royal life. Each required speech was a summit of terror. This physical struggle became a metaphor for his entire existence. A man with a title who literally could not find his voice. He was constantly, painfully overshadowed by his confident, articulate older brother, David, who moved through the world with an ease and a fluency that Birdie could only dream of, making his own struggle all the more stark and isolating. The environment of his childhood offered no solace. It only etched the anxiety deeper into his character. His father, King George V, was not a monster, but he was a product of his time and his station, a formidable, unsmiling naval man who believed in rigid discipline and emotional restraint. He was a harsh disciplinarian who saw his children's flaws, especially Birdie's left-handedness, which he forced him to correct, and his stammer, as personal failings that needed to be drilled out. The king's booming, impatient voice and his famous command, "Get it out," when Birdie struggled to speak, were not therapeutic, they were traumatizing. This parental pressure, intended to forge strength, instead compounded the anxiety. It cemented in Birdie's mind the belief that he was fundamentally flawed, reinforcing his struggle to be heard in a family and a world that only seemed to have ears for his older brother. He was, by any measure, one of the most eligible bachelors in the world. As the Duke of York, he was a prince of the United Kingdom, a son of the King Emperor. He lived in palaces, represented the crown, and was firmly entrenched in the line of succession. His future was secure, his status unimpeachable, and yet, when he found the one woman he truly loved, the woman whose spirit and warmth he felt could complete him, she did not leap at the chance to become a duchess and potentially a future queen. Instead, she flatly rejected his proposal, not just once in a moment of hesitation, but twice with clear-eyed determination. How could this be? How could a man who seemingly had everything to offer be so thoroughly refused by the woman he adored? The story of this rejection begins in 1921. At a society ball, Prince Albert, Birdie, was formally introduced to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the daughter of a Scottish earl. She was vibrant, witty, and possessed a disarming social grace and an iron will. Birdie was immediately and completely captivated. She was a breath of fresh air, a whirlwind of charm and character that stood in stark contrast to the stiff formality of his royal world. He saw in her a partner, a source of strength, and a deep, uncomplicated warmth. But while he was smitten, she was not. She enjoyed his company. She found him kind and earnest, but she was acutely aware of the man, and more importantly, the title. She saw the shy, stammering prince, and behind him, she saw the suffocating institution he represented. Her reluctance was not a game. It was a profound and existential fear. Lady Elizabeth, having served as a helper in hospitals during World War I, had a strong sense of self and a desire for a life with some measure of personal freedom. She saw what royal life entailed. She later articulated her terror of the intolerable restrictions that would be placed upon her. To marry Birdie meant surrendering her identity to become a public figure, to be scrutinized, criticized, and forever bound by protocol. She would no longer be Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She would be Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. She feared this gilded cage more than she desired a title. She wanted a life of her own, a husband of her own choosing, and a home that was a sanctuary, not a stage. But Birdie, though quiet, possessed a deep well of stubborn persistence. He knew with an unshakable certainty that she was the only woman for him. He continued his courtship, writing letters and visiting her family home. He proposed a second time, and again, she refused, still terrified of the royal yoke. But he would not be deterred. For 2 long years, he waited and he hoped, a prince pining for a woman who did not want his world. Finally, in January 1923, he proposed for the 3rd and final time. It is said he vowed that he would marry no one else. This time, moved by the depth of his devotion and the genuine, decent man she saw beneath the title, she accepted. It was a crucial distinction that would define their entire lives. She was not marrying the prince. She was marrying the man. Their life as the Duke and Duchess of York was precisely what she had hoped for, and what he had craved. It was not a grand, sweeping public fairy tale played out in the headlines. Instead, they forged a quiet, deep, and profoundly supportive partnership. They were a team. They found their genuine happiness away from the main spotlight, which was perpetually fixed on Birdie's brother, the Prince of Wales. They embraced their supporting roles, focusing on their duties, their shared interests, and, most importantly, on building a private, domestic life that was a refuge from the demands of their station. They were the dependable, domestic Yorks, and they were perfectly content with that. This contentment was cemented with the arrival of their 2 daughters. First, Princess Elizabeth in 1926, the serious, dutiful child they called Lilibet. Then, 4 years later, Princess Margaret Rose, the charming, vivacious, and mischievous one. For Birdie, this family unit was his greatest achievement and his deepest joy. He adored his daughters and was a doting, gentle, and present father, playing games with them on the floor and reading them stories. He was actively, consciously creating the warm, loving, and secure family life that he himself had been so cruelly denied. The small, tight-knit group, which he famously called us for, was his entire world, a sanctuary of normality he would protect at all costs. But the walls of this sanctuary, so carefully constructed, were made of glass. Their peaceful, private existence was entirely conditional, dependent on the stability of the one man who stood between Birdie and the throne, his brother, David. Now King Edward VIII, after their father's death in January 1936, was driven by a very different set of values. His ambitions were not for political power or military glory, but for personal, romantic fulfillment. He was a man who believed the rules of an ancient institution should bend to his modern desires, and this belief, this relentless pursuit of his own happiness, was about to shatter his brother's peaceful life forever. He was, for a time, the king his people had dreamed of. King Edward VIII was modern, empathetic, and dazzlingly charismatic. He visited depressed mining towns and seemed to genuinely care. He was the very picture of a 20th century monarch, and the public adored him. But this charismatic king had a fatal flaw, at least in the eyes of the establishment that governed his empire. He had fallen desperately in love with a woman who, by every conceivable measure of the time, was the one woman on earth he could not marry. Her name was Wallis Simpson, and she represented a fundamental threat to the very foundations of his throne. The objections to Wallis Simpson were numerous and, in the context of 1930s Britain, insurmountable. Firstly, she was an American, a citizen of a nation viewed by the British aristocracy as brash, unrefined, and socially inferior. Secondly, and far more catastrophically, she was a divorcee. This was not a minor social faux pas, it was a constitutional crisis in the making. The King of England is also the supreme governor of the Church of England, a church which, at that time, forbade the remarriage of any person whose original spouse was still living. To make matters infinitely worse, Wallis was not just a divorcee. She was in the process of seeking her second divorce. To the establishment, she was a twice-married American adventuress, and she was utterly, completely, and non-negotiably unacceptable. The reaction from the pillars of British power was not just disapproval, it was horror. The Church of England, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, was resolute. The king could not marry this woman and remain the head of the church. The British government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, was equally horrified, viewing the relationship as a reckless indulgence that threatened the stability of the nation and the empire. They made it clear that Parliament would never accept Mrs. Simpson as queen. The choice was laid, bare with brutal clarity. A king could not marry a divorcee with two living ex-husbands and remain king. The constitutional machinery of the state and the ancient doctrines of the church locked shields against their monarch. King Edward VIII was thus presented with the most severe ultimatum a monarch could face. He was told by his prime minister that he had to choose. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no path to having both. The government would resign before it accepted Wallis as queen, and the very fabric of the Constitution would be torn apart. It was a stark, binary choice, Wallis or the throne. He was forced to decide between his sacred, inherited duty to his empire and his personal, all-consuming love for one woman. For a man who had spent his life chafing against the constraints of duty, it was an agonizing, but perhaps inevitable, decision. On December 10, 1936, after ruling for less than a year, he chose love. In a small room at his residence, Fort Belvedere, he gathered his brothers, including a devastated Birdie, and signed the official instrument of abdication. He renounced the throne for himself and for all his descendants. He had abandoned his post. The following night he addressed the world via radio in a famous speech where he declared he found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. He then fled the country, leaving behind a crown, an empire, and a family in turmoil. For Birdie, this act was not a grand romantic gesture, it was a cataclysmic betrayal. It was the ultimate act of dereliction of duty, the very concept their father, King George V, had drilled into them since birth. His brother, the rightful king, had not died in battle or succumbed to illness. He had simply quit. He had fled his responsibilities, shirking the sacred vow he had made, and in doing so, had left Birdie to clean up the catastrophic mess. He had abdicated not just the throne, but his responsibility as a brother. He had dumped the weight of the world onto the one man he knew was least equipped to bear it, his shy, stammering, unprepared younger brother. What happens when the one job you never wanted, the one role you were never trained for, the one destiny you spent your entire life praying would pass you by, suddenly and irrevocably becomes yours? This is not a promotion, it is a condemnation. Birdie had been trained to be the Duke of York, a supporting player. He had never been included in state meetings, never been given the constitutional tutoring that his brother had. He was, in every sense, an apprentice who was suddenly being forced to become the master of a global empire, all while the institution he was inheriting was crumbling in a scandal of his brother's making. Birdie was, in a word, terrified. The night of the abdication, he was no longer Prince Albert, Duke of York. He was now, by default, King George VI. He chose the name George to honor his father and to create a sense of stability and continuity to immediately signal a return to the dutiful traditional monarchy of George V and to distance his reign from the scandal of Edward VIII. But this public-facing decision masked a private terror. He famously wrote in his diary that night, "I am not a king." This was not a statement of modesty. It was a raw cry of despair from a man who believed, to his very core, that he was utterly unfit for the task ahead. The public image of a stoic new king was a facade. In private, the 40-year-old man was overwhelmed. He reportedly broke down completely, sobbing on the shoulder of his formidable mother, Queen Mary. His cry to her, "This is terrible. I never wanted this to happen," revealed the depth of his despair. He felt abandoned, betrayed, and crushingly, hopelessly unprepared. He was inheriting a damaged, tarnished crown, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that a terrible storm was gathering on the horizon. The abdication crisis was a domestic fire, but across the channel, the far more dangerous inferno of Nazi Germany was growing, and a man who dreaded speaking to a small room would now have to lead his nation against it. The crisis was not just psychological, it was profoundly practical. The new King of England could not speak. In an era before television, when the radio was the primary tool of mass communication, a leader's voice was his most powerful weapon. Franklin Roosevelt was inspiring America with his fireside chats. Adolf Hitler was mesmerizing Germany with his thunderous, hypnotic rallies. These leaders were masters of the airwaves. How could Birdie, now King George VI, possibly lead his nation into an inevitable, terrifying war if he couldn't even address them over the wireless? His stammer was no longer a personal embarrassment. It had become a critical matter of national security. In a desperate and humble admission of his own limitations, he secretly sought help, but he didn't go to the established, aristocratic physicians of the royal court. Instead, he placed his trust in Lionel Logue, an unconventional, unknown speech therapist from Australia. This was a radical act. Logue was a colonial, a commoner, and his methods were entirely unorthodox. The therapy began in secret before the abdication, but now, with the weight of the crown on his head, these sessions became a lifeline. The King of England, in a modest London office, was placing his confidence and his nation's future in the hands of this one man. Logue's genius was that he understood the problem was not just in the king's throat, it was in his mind. The stammer was a physical manifestation of a lifetime of anxiety, discipline, and perceived inadequacy. Their work, immortalized in the king's speech, went far beyond simple mechanical drills. Through deeply frustrating breathing exercises, profanity-laced vocal warm-ups, and, most importantly, probing psychological coaching, Logue didn't just treat the stammer. He slowly, painstakingly, helped the king build the confidence he had never been allowed to develop. He was part therapist, part drill sergeant, and part friend, forcing Birdie to believe that he was a king, and that he did have a voice. While Logue was healing the king's voice, his wife, Queen Elizabeth, was healing the monarchy's image. With Birdie's ascension, she was no longer just a duchess, she was the queen consort, and she instantly understood the gravity of her new role. She became, without question, his single greatest asset. She was his unwavering emotional rock, the one person who could calm his rages, soothe his fears, and give him the constant reassurance he needed. But she was far more than just a supportive spouse. She became his chief public relations strategist, a brilliant and intuitive operator who understood that their very survival depended on winning back the hearts of the people. Where Birdie was shy and hesitant, Elizabeth was warm and steel-willed. She knew that hiding in the palace would be disastrous, confirming the public's worst fears of a weak, frightened king. Her strategy was one of bold, relentless visibility. She gently but firmly pushed him back into the public eye, arranging grueling public tours, including a critical and wildly successful visit to Canada and the United States in 1939. She stood by his side at every moment, her famous, unwavering smile acting as a shield and a signal. She was teaching him and the world how to be king by projecting an aura of confidence he did not yet feel. Elizabeth's core mission was to repair the profound breach of trust left by the abdication. The public felt that Edward VIII had treated the crown as a personal plaything and had abandoned them for his own selfish desires. The monarchy, as an institution, suddenly looked frivolous, unstable, and out of touch. She knew that they, the quiet, dutiful Yorks, had to embody the exact opposite. They had to restore the people's faith by demonstrating, in every public act, that their reign would be defined not by privilege, but by unwavering duty and selfless service. And so, she perfected her public persona, the smiling Duchess transformed into the nation's beloved queen. Her constant, calm, and smiling presence by the king's side became a powerful symbol of reassurance. Her social grace was her weapon. She could charm a room, connect with a crowd, and project a sense of warmth and stability that was desperately needed. She became the approachable, maternal, and yet deeply dignified face of the new monarchy. The public, so recently betrayed, fell in love with her, and through her, they began to trust him. Together, they formulated a powerful counter-narrative to the scandal of the abdication. The previous reign had been defined by a glamorous, childless, globe-trotting couple who had shirked their duty. The new reign would be defined by a very different and very deliberate new image. This was the masterstroke of their early reign, the branding of the royal family as US, for a simple, powerful phrase the king himself used to describe his family unit, the king, the queen, and their two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. This was not a casual nickname. It was a deliberate and brilliant public relations strategy. US4 was a brand that represented everything his brother was not. They were a perfect, dutiful, and deeply traditional family. They were the ideal of domestic stability, a Christian family united in love and service. Where Edward and Wallace represented scandal, divorce, and self-interest, US4 represented wholesomeness, fidelity, and tradition. It was a potent image that immediately set a new, more sober and relatable tone for the monarchy. This image of domestic stability, of a simple, loving family, became an unexpectedly powerful symbol for a nation teetering on the brink of chaos. As Adolf Hitler's power grew and the shadows of war lengthened across Europe, the British people could look to their new king and see not a fickle playboy, but a dedicated family man. The monarchy, through the US4 brand, became a symbol of the very values family, home, and duty that the nation would soon be fighting to defend. It was the anchor of stability in an increasingly unstable world. That stability was put to the ultimate test when war was declared in September 1939, as Hitler's forces swept across Europe, and the threat of invasion became terrifyingly real. London itself became the target. During the Blitz, as bombs rained down on the city night after night, the government and the cabinet, fearing for the king's life and the continuity of the government, begged the royal family to flee. The logical, safe, and strategic move was to evacuate the king and his family to the safety of Canada, to lead a government in exile. The king's response, however, was immediate and absolute. "We will not leave." That was the final word. During the darkest days of the Blitz, when London was burning, the king and queen emphatically refused to abandon their city and their people. Queen Elizabeth famously articulated their position: "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." This decision was a colossal gamble. It was also the single most important act of their reign. It was a defiant statement of solidarity, a message to Hitler and to their own people. "We are in this with you. We will share the danger. We will not run." They did, however, make one crucial concession to safety, one that demonstrated their personal sacrifice. They sent their daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, to Windsor Castle, outside the primary blast radius of central London. While safer, it was not without risk, and it meant the US4 family was separated for long stretches, the parents in the capital, the children in the countryside. This separation, this willingness to break up their own cherished family unit for the sake of duty, was another powerful symbol that resonated deeply with the thousands of other British families who were being separated by evacuation and military service. The king and queen, however, remained at Buckingham Palace. They deliberately and pointedly stayed in the very heart of the city that was Hitler's primary target. The palace was not just a home, it was now a fortress and a symbol. Their refusal to leave transformed them from mere figureheads into active participants in the struggle. It was an act of profound defiance and, more importantly, of shared suffering. The king and queen were enduring the same nightly terror, the same sleepless nights, and the same risks as the ordinary citizens in the East End. This created an unbreakable bond of shared experience. Hitler, recognizing the immense symbolic power of the king and queen, specifically targeted them. He believed that killing the monarchs or forcing them to flee would shatter British morale. On September 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe made a direct attempt. Several bombs were dropped directly on Buckingham Palace. The attack was terrifyingly close. A near miss that could have changed the course of history. But it was the Queen's reaction to this attempt on her life that shocked everyone and became the defining legend of her wartime service. It was not a minor incident. At least 9 bombs struck the palace complex. The king and queen were in their private apartments when they heard the whine and crash of the explosions. They took cover as ceilings collapsed and windows shattered around them, sending shards of glass flying through the rooms where, just moments before, they had been sitting. They were nearly killed. They had faced the same indiscriminate terror as any other Londoner, looking death directly in the eye. Their home, the symbol of the nation, was wounded, just as the city was. Surveying the rubble of their own home, the shattered glass and broken masonry, Queen Elizabeth delivered the most famous, and perhaps most brilliant, public relations line of the 20th century. With a calm, determined look, she said, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." The East End of London, the city's poorest and most densely populated area, had been systematically and brutally pulverized by the Luftwaffe. The Queen had felt a sense of shame at her own relative safety. Now, having shared their fate, she felt she had earned the right to empathize. This one sentence permanently bonded the crown to the common people. Hitler's attack backfired spectacularly. It was a profound strategic miscalculation. Instead of breaking the king, the queen, or the British people, the bombing of the palace galvanized them. It enraged the public and transformed the king and queen into heroes, living symbols of the nation's defiance. The attack didn't break the monarchy, it forged it anew. The bond between the crown and the people, which had been so badly damaged by the abdication, was now permanently reforged in the fires of the Blitz, tempered by shared sacrifice and mutual respect. Throughout the long, grueling years of the war, the king and queen were a relentless, visible presence. Their duty was not passive, it was active and exhausting. They refused to be shut away. They undertook a punishing schedule, visiting factories to boost the morale of munitions workers, touring bomb sites in the immediate, smoky aftermath to comfort the homeless, and walking through hospital wards to sit with the grievously wounded. They traveled to military bases to inspect troops before they deployed. This was the true, grinding work of leadership, sharing the pain, absorbing the grief, and reflecting back the courage of their people, day after day. And what of the king's greatest fear? The radio broadcasts, the crucible of war, and the tireless work of Lionel Logue had forged a new man. The king's wartime broadcasts, especially his annual Christmas speeches, became a vital source of calm strength for millions across the empire. His voice was not perfect. The hesitation, the ghost of the stammer, was still there. But this imperfection became his greatest strength. The public heard a man who was clearly struggling, a man who was not a slick orator, but who was forcing himself to speak, forcing himself to be brave. His effort became a mirror for their own. His calm, determined, imperfect voice became the sound of the nation's resolve. When the war in Europe finally ended on V-Day in May 1945, London erupted in a spontaneous, joyous celebration. A massive crowd, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, surged towards Buckingham Palace. They were not just celebrating the end of the war, they were celebrating the people who had seen them through it. The chant that rose from the crowd was personal and filled with love. We want the king. We want the queen. When the royal family, including the future Queen Elizabeth II in her military uniform, stepped onto the balcony, the roar was deafening. They were no longer the reluctant, terrified couple of 1936. They were the beloved, triumphant symbols of victory. He had done it. The terrified, stammering younger son had risen to the occasion. He had preserved the monarchy, weathered the abdication, and led his nation through its darkest hour to its greatest victory. He had, in every sense, saved his nation and his family's crown. But the crown, in return, had taken everything from him. The victory had come at a terrible, personal cost. The burden he had carried for 15 years had been too heavy. the price of duty too high. The immense, unrelenting stress of the war years, coupled with a lifetime of crippling anxiety, had ravaged his body. Compounding this was his heavy smoking, a common habit of the era, but one that he had leaned on as a crutch to manage his nerves. The constant strain of his public duties, the terror of his broadcasts, and the weight of a global conflict had destroyed his fragile health. The duty he had refused to shirk had, in the end, broken him. By 1951, the king was a desperately sick man. He was diagnosed with severe lung cancer, a direct result of his heavy smoking. In a desperate attempt to save his life, surgeons performed a radical pneumonectomy, removing his entire left lung. The operation was a trauma from which he never truly recovered. The public, who were only told of arterial blockages, were shocked by his appearance. Photographs from late 1951 show a gaunt, frail, and hollowed-out man, a shadow of his former self, waving a tired farewell to his daughter Elizabeth as she set off on a royal tour. He was too old to take himself. On the night of February 6, 1952, at Sandringham House, the king he had never wanted to be died peacefully in his sleep from a coronary thrombosis. He was only 56 years old. He was a man who had been burned out by service, a king who had given his life, quite literally, for his country. The man who was never meant to be king had died as one of the most beloved monarchs in British history, leaving behind a legacy of courage, duty, and sacrifice. His death, a tragedy for the nation and his family, was also a constitutional mechanism. The instant he drew his last breath, the reign of King George VI ended, and the reign of Queen Elizabeth II began. His death marked the end of one era, defined by global war and recovery, and the beginning of another. The news reached his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, in a remote lodge in Kenya. The young woman who had been a cherished part of us four, the girl her father had doted on, had climbed a tree as a princess and came down as the queen. His wife, Queen Elizabeth, the woman who had been his rock and his strategist, was suddenly a widow. She was only 51 years old. Her partner, the man she had loved and guided for nearly 30 years, the man whose career she had essentially co-managed, was gone. Her life's work was over. She was no longer the queen. A new, younger Queen Elizabeth now took precedence. But for a woman of such formidable will and public popularity, her duty, she felt, was not over. She could have retired into a quiet, wealthy obscurity. Instead, she invented an entirely new role for herself, to differentiate herself from her daughter, the new queen. She adopted the title Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. It was a brilliant stroke, defining her new position as the matriarch of the nation. She did not fade away. She became the nation's beloved grandmother, a living, smiling link to the defiant spirit of the Blitz, a symbol of continuity and tradition who would support her own daughter's reign for another 50 years. How did this happen? How did a terrified man who believed he was unfit to rule and a reluctant woman who feared the loss of her freedom become the very blueprint for the modern monarchy? How did this unlikely pair, thrown into chaos by scandal, not only save the crown but redefine it for a new century, setting the stage for the most successful reign in British history? The answer lies not in their grandeur, but in their partnership and their profound understanding of a new, more democratic age. Their core strength, from the very beginning, was their partnership. They were a perfect synergy of opposing qualities. Her social grace, her effortless charm, and her steel-willed determination balanced his profound shyness, his rigid sense of duty, and his anxious nature. She was the public face. He was the dutiful core. She gave him the confidence to face the crowds, and he gave her the platform to deploy her considerable people skills. They were a team, and the public saw in them a marriage of equals, a partnership built on mutual love, respect, and a shared, unbreakable commitment to service. Together, they fundamentally shifted the monarchy's public image. They were the pivot point. They inherited an institution defined by distant, imperial power and staggering privilege. They transformed it into one defined by family, duty, and service. Das for Brand was the beginning of this transformation. Their actions during the war cemented it. They made the monarchy relatable, vulnerable, and admirable. This new legacy, this powerful combination of domestic stability, personal empathy, and unwavering, selfless duty, all forged in the crucible of crisis, became the bedrock. It was this foundation, built by the reluctant king and his brilliant queen, upon which their daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, would build her entire historic 70-year reign.